Imagine waking up one morning with $2 billion in the bank, a corporation with your name on the door, a son who is everything you hoped he would be, and still feeling like you are about to lose everything that matters. Not the money. Not the company. Something smaller than that and more important than that. Something you cannot insure or transfer or protect with a legal team. Imagine feeling like the very wealth you bled for, the empire you built from absolute nothing with your bare hands and your refusal to quit. Imagine feeling like all of it was slowly becoming a wall between your child and the one thing in this world that actually makes a life worth living. Real love. The kind that doesn't calculate. The kind that stays when the private jet is gone and the glass tower is dark and there is nothing left to gain from being in the room. Now imagine being willing to give up everything, your identity, your comfort, your pride, to find out if that kind of love even exists anymore. That is exactly what Richard and Carol Hayes did. And the story of what happened next is one of the most quietly devastating, deeply human things I have ever had to tell. Stay with me. Because nothing about this goes the way you think it will. Before we go any further into this story, take 2 seconds right now and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We genuinely want to know. And if you are new here and this is the first time you have found this channel, click subscribe right now so you never miss a story like this one. We put everything into these, and we do not want you to miss what is coming. Now, let us go back to the beginning, because to understand what Richard and Carol Hayes did, you have to understand where they came from. And where they came from was about as far from $1 billion as a person can get. Richard Hayes was born in 1961 in Macon, Georgia, the second of 3 children in a household where money was discussed in the same hushed, anxious tones that other families reserved for illness or bad news. His father, James Hayes, worked the floor of a textile plant for 31 years, the same plant, the same shift, the same lunch pail every morning, and came home every evening smelling of machine oil and something close to resignation. His mother, Dorothy, cleaned offices downtown on weekends and took in alterations during the week, her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a pin cushion strapped to her wrist like armor. They were not unhappy people. They were people who had accepted the dimensions of their life and worked within them faithfully and without complaint. But Richard watched them and felt something that he could never fully articulate as a child and only understood decades later. He felt the weight of a dream that had never been given permission to exist. He was 12 years old the first time he took apart a radio and put it back together in a different configuration just to see if it would still work. It did. He was 14 when he wrote his first simple program on a borrowed school computer and stayed 3 hours past closing time because he could not stop adding to it. His math teacher, a quiet woman named Mrs. Aldrich who wore the same brown cardigan every Tuesday, told him once in a low voice after class that he had a mind that was made for problems nobody had thought to solve yet. He never forgot that. In a life that offered very few people telling him what he was capable of, Mrs. Aldrich's words became something he returned to again and again like a stone worn smooth from handling. He got a partial scholarship to Georgia State. He worked nights at a gas station and weekends delivering furniture to cover the rest. He ate badly and slept less and studied more than anyone in his program and graduated with honors and exactly one job offer from a small tech consulting firm in Atlanta that paid just enough to keep him from moving back to Macon. He took it. He kept his head down for 2 years and learned everything they would teach him and then started asking questions they did not have answers for, which made some of his colleagues uncomfortable and made his supervisor quietly furious. It did not matter. By then, Richard already knew that the job was temporary. The idea he had been carrying in the back of his head since he was 14 years old was getting louder, and he was running out of reasons to keep it quiet. Carol and Gwen arrived in Richard's life on a campus bench in the middle of a rainstorm that neither of them had been prepared for, which was, she would later say, an appropriate beginning. Her family had come to Tennessee from Vietnam in 1975 when she was 3 years old, her parents carrying almost nothing and arriving in a country that did not speak their language with a determination that Carol would spend the rest of her life trying to fully understand. Her father, Min, opened a small restaurant in a town that was not expecting a Vietnamese restaurant and made it work through sheer quality and stubbornness, rising before dawn every day to make broth from scratch and refusing to cut corners even when it would have been easier and more profitable to do so. Her mother, Lynn, worked beside him every day and also managed the household and helped Carol and her brother with homework at the kitchen table every evening after the restaurant closed, her hands still smelling of lemongrass and star anise. Carol grew up understanding two things with absolute certainty. The first was that nothing worth having came without sacrifice. The second was that sacrifice was only worth making for something true. She studied accounting at college not because she loved numbers but because she was practical and she understood that the world ran on them and she intended to understand the world. She was rewriting a set of notes she had already taken twice when the rain started and she refused to move from the bench because she was almost finished and she had an exam the next morning. Richard sat down beside her with his economics textbook and also refused to move because he was almost finished and also had an exam the next morning. They argued for 2 minutes about who had more right to the bench and then, without either of them making a conscious decision, started talking about something else entirely. They talked about ambition. They talked about their parents. They talked about what it meant to want something badly enough to bet your whole life on it. They talked for 3 hours in the rain and by the time the rain stopped they had forgotten about the bench entirely. They dated for 6 years, which Richard's friends found inexplicably long and Carol's friends found entirely sensible. They were married in a courthouse in 1987 with $23 in their joint account and Carol's mother's pearl earrings and a lunch afterward at a Thai restaurant where they ordered one dish and split it and called it a celebration. They meant it. They were 26 years old and broke and absolutely clear-eyed about each other, which is rarer than it sounds and more valuable than anything money can buy. Richard proposed the company 6 months after the wedding, sitting at the kitchen table of their one-bedroom apartment in Atlanta while Carol was reconciling their checking account. He said, "I think we should start the company." She looked up from the ledger and said, "I think so too." That was the whole conversation. The next morning, they began. Hayes Technology started in 1988 as a software consulting firm operating out of their apartment with a second-hand IBM computer that Richard had repaired himself, a borrowed router, and Carol's accounting skills holding the finances together with the same meticulous care she applied to everything. The first year, they had 4 clients. The second year, 9. They worked until 2 in the morning most nights. Richard coded and built systems and went to client meetings in his one good Blazer and Carol handled everything else, the invoices, the tax filings, the client follow-ups, the business plan, and dinner, which some months was rice and beans 5 days a week not because they were trying to be economical but because it was genuinely what they could afford. They knew the particular texture of having nothing. They knew what it felt like to check a bank balance before buying groceries. They knew hunger not as a metaphor but as a specific physical reality with a specific emotional weight. And that knowledge, that bone-deep memory of what it felt like to have nothing, became the foundation of everything they built and the lens through which they saw everything that followed. By 1995, they had 12 employees and a small office in Midtown Atlanta and a contract with a healthcare company that changed the scale of what was possible. By 2001, they had survived the dot-com crash by pivoting into enterprise software and logistics systems with a speed and decisiveness that their competitors could not match. By 2008, they survived the financial crisis through discipline and by not having overextended in directions that looked profitable but were not sound. Carol had always been the one who knew the difference between what looked good and what was true, and in 2008, that ability was worth more than any amount of ambition. By 2013, Hayes Technology had expanded into clean energy infrastructure and automated logistics systems and had operations in 11 states and over 4,000 employees. Richard and Carol Hayes were, quietly and without much public performance of the fact, worth somewhere north of $2 billion. They had never been on a reality show. They avoided most press. They gave significant amounts to education foundations and food security programs and a small scholarship fund at Georgia State that Dorothy Hayes, Richard's mother, never knew was named after her because Richard had used her middle name and she had always been too modest to investigate. Their names appeared occasionally in Forbes and in business press, but they did not put the magazines on display. They drove sensible cars. Their house in Atlanta was large but not ostentatious. They still argued about whose turn it was to take out the trash, and Carol still won most of the arguments, and Richard was still not entirely sure how that happened every single time. And then there was Ethan. Ethan James Hayes was born in 1993, the same year Richard registered the company's first formal business entity, and Carol used to joke that they had started two things that year that they had absolutely no idea what they were doing with. Ethan grew up in a household that had money but was run as if money was a tool rather than an identity. He did chores. He had a curfew. He worked a part-time job at a hardware store the summer he was 16 because Richard told him he needed to know what it felt like to stand on his feet all day for someone else's goal before he could appreciate standing on his feet for his own. He got no car until he had saved half the cost of one himself. He was told the family's financial situation clearly and without dramatizing it at an age when most wealthy parents were still pretending to their children that money was simply a background condition of existence like electricity and hot water. Richard and Carol were deliberate about all of it. They had not forgotten where they came from, and they were determined that Ethan would not be allowed to forget either, even though he had never personally lived it. He was sharp and kind and funny in a dry, underplayed way that you either understood immediately or took a few conversations to figure out. He had Richard's jaw and Carol's eyes and both of their stubbornness, which meant that any argument with him required patience and evidence, and even then you were not guaranteed a result. He had gone to Stanford, which was the one concession to prestige that Richard had allowed himself to feel quietly proud of, though he never said so directly. Ethan had studied business and computer science and graduated into a position at Hayes Technology where he had been given real responsibility and real accountability, and where he performed with a seriousness and competence that Richard would have respected in anyone, not just his own son. He was 29 years old. He was everything his parents had hoped he would be. And they were absolutely terrified for him. Here is the thing about raising a child in wealth that no parenting book adequately addresses. You can teach humility. You can model it every day of your own life. You can tell stories about where you came from and what it cost and what it meant until the stories become part of the fabric of who your child believes themselves to be. You can limit spending and require work and have honest conversations about money and values and what a life of meaning actually looks like. You can do all of that and do it well and mean every word of it. And you still cannot control the world your child eventually walks into. And the world Ethan Hayes walked into was a world that had already decided who he was before he arrived. It was a world of tech galas and charity dinners and networking events where a handshake meant a future merger and a smile meant a prospective alliance, and where the Hayes name arrived in the room approximately 30 seconds before Ethan himself did, and did a significant amount of work on his behalf before he opened his mouth. Richard had watched this happen to other families over the years. Colleagues whose children had grown up in wealth and then found themselves surrounded by people who were not quite what they appeared to be, friends who were really connections waiting to be activated, romantic partners who were really strategic decisions dressed up in affection. He had watched the slow, quiet erosion that happened to a person who begins to lose the ability to know whether anyone in their life truly sees them. It was not a dramatic erosion. It did not happen all at once. It was gradual, like water wearing stone, and by the time the person noticed it, there was often very little of the original surface left. Richard did not want that for Ethan. He had worked too hard and built too much and loved his son too completely to watch that happen without doing something about it. He just did not yet know what something was. Carol's fear was more specific. She worried about Ethan's heart. Not metaphorically, she worried about the particular quality of how Ethan loved, which was completely and without reservation once he trusted someone. She had watched him as a child give his full loyalty to a friend and then be genuinely wounded when that friend moved on without looking back. She had watched him as a teenager put everything into a relationship that ended in a way that took him longer to recover from than he would ever have admitted. He was not naive. But he was wholehearted, and wholehearted people in a world full of calculation are vulnerable in ways that clever people are not. Carol knew this because she was wholehearted too. She had been lucky enough to find Richard early, before the world had time to make her careful in the wrong ways. She wanted the same for Ethan, and she was not sure he was going to get it. For 2 years before the story really begins, Ethan had been seeing a woman named Vanessa Cole. Vanessa was beautiful in the way that requires maintenance and intention and a certain awareness of how one is being perceived at all times. She was educated, Duke undergraduate, a master's degree from Northwestern, and she worked in luxury brand consulting, which meant she moved through spaces where money and aesthetics intersected, and she was very good at understanding both. She talked about Ethan with warmth. She posted photographs of them at events with captions that were affectionate without being specific, the way someone writes when they are managing an image rather than expressing a feeling. She was charming at dinners with Richard and Carol, asking Carol about the early days of the company and Richard about the industry with the focused attention of someone who has learned that appearing interested is its own form of currency. Richard watched her and could not put his finger on what bothered him. Carol watched her and could, but she waited. She waited because she was not certain, and because she respected Ethan's autonomy, and because she understood that a mother's instinct about a son's girlfriend is not the same thing as reliable evidence. She waited for a long time. And then she stopped waiting because she did not have a choice. The dinner party was in September, on a warm Friday evening at the Hayes home in Atlanta. Ethan had organized it, 12 people, a mix of his friends and colleagues and 2 couples Richard and Carol were close to. The food was good and the conversation was easy, and the evening had the relaxed, well-lubricated quality of a gathering among people who like each other and have had enough wine. Ethan stepped out around 9 o'clock to take a work call on the back porch. Carol was on her way to the kitchen to get more ice when she passed the hallway that opened into the sitting room where Vanessa was standing with 2 of her friends, women Carol had met before and not warmed to, and the door was half open and the voices were carrying, and Carol heard Vanessa say, clearly and without any self-consciousness, "He's sweet, he genuinely is. But let's be honest. If his last name wasn't Hayes, I wouldn't have given him a second look at that gala. You know how it is." Her friends laughed. One of them said something low that Carol could not make out. Vanessa said, "No, exactly." They laughed again. Carol did not stop walking. She went to the kitchen and got the ice and stood at the counter for a moment with her hands flat on the cool granite and her jaw set and her heart doing something complicated in her chest. Then she went back out to the party and smiled and refilled glasses and talked to people and waited for the evening to end. She was very good at waiting. She had learned it from her mother, who had been a master of it. You waited and you breathed and you kept your face steady and you did not let anyone see the thing that was moving around in you until you were somewhere private enough to look at it directly. That night, after the last guest had gone and Ethan had driven home and the house was quiet, Richard found Carol at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she had made and not touched, the steam long since gone cold. She told him what she heard. She said it plainly and without editorializing, because she did not need to editorialize. The words were enough on their own. Richard listened without interrupting, which was not his natural tendency, and when she finished he was quiet for a long time. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, a car passed on the street. Then he said, "We have to do something." Carol said, "I know." They sat there until midnight, talking quietly and then more quietly, and by the time they got up from the table they had the rough shape of a plan. It was not a perfect plan. It had a flaw at its center that neither of them could see yet because the intention behind it felt righteous and protective and entirely motivated by love, and love has always been excellent at making intelligent people temporarily blind to the costs of what they are doing in its name. The plan was built in 3 stages, and each stage required a particular kind of sacrifice that Richard and Carol approached with the same systematic discipline they had applied to building their company 3 decades earlier. They were not impulsive people. They did not act without thinking. But they were also people who, once they had decided something, moved. Stage 1 was Richard's public step back from Hayes Technology. He announced to the board and then to the press that he was stepping back from his day-to-day executive role for health and personal reasons, effective in 6 weeks. This was not entirely untrue. His doctor had been recommending a reduction in stress for 2 years, and Richard had been ignoring the recommendation with the same calm certainty he brought to most things he had decided not to deal with yet. The announcement caused the expected ripple of financial press speculation, which Carol managed carefully through their communications team. What the press did not know was that Richard and Carol had also quietly and deliberately seeded, through a small number of trusted industry contacts, a rumor of financial difficulty at Hayes Technology. Not a collapse. Not a scandal. Just a whisper. A vague suggestion that the company's recent expansion into new energy infrastructure had created exposure that might be more significant than the public balance sheet suggested. It was a controlled, surgically precise piece of misinformation planted just far enough from the center of things that it could not be easily verified or denied. Richard did not enjoy this part. But he did it. Stage 2 was the destination. Carol's college friend Martha Brennan owned a rental property in a small town in western North Carolina called Clover Ridge, about 40 minutes from Asheville up roads that wound through mountain forest and smelled of pine and wet earth and would smoke in the colder months. Clover Ridge had approximately 800 residents. It had a hardware store, a diner, 2 churches, a small library that was open 3 days a week and run entirely by volunteers, a post office, and a farmer's market on Saturday mornings that drew people from the surrounding area and had been running continuously since 1962. It was the kind of place that people who grew up there either left as soon as they were old enough to drive or stayed in for the rest of their lives, and the ones who stayed had a particular quality about them. A rootedness, a lack of performance, an orientation toward actual things rather than projected ones. Carol had visited once years ago and remembered it the way you remember places that have a specific gravity to them. She called Martha. Martha said yes immediately and asked no questions, which had always been one of Martha's best qualities. Richard and Carol would go to Clover Ridge as Richard and Carol Park, using Carol's maiden name, Gwyn simplified to Park for ease of use in a small southern town, a decision Carol made with her eyes open and a particular kind of resignation about the way the world still worked. They would be retired schoolteachers from Knoxville. Richard had taught high school math. Carol had taught middle school English. They had 2 grown children and 5 grandchildren, and they had always wanted to spend more time in the mountains, and now they finally had the time. This cover story had the virtue of being simple and warm and not requiring much elaboration, because people in small towns generally respond to retired teachers the way they respond to returning veterans, with a kind of automatic, unexamined respect that closes most conversational investigations before they can begin. Stage 3 was Ethan. This was the part that required the most careful construction and the most deliberate misdirection, and it was the part that Carol thought about longest and argued with herself about most thoroughly before she agreed to it. They could not tell Ethan the truth. If they told him the truth, that they were going to a small town to observe him in an environment where no one knew who he was, he would refuse, or he would comply but perform a version of himself for the observation rather than simply being himself, which would defeat the entire purpose. They needed him there without knowing why he was there. They needed him in Clover Ridge as just a man, with a modest allowance and a rented truck and no assistants and no Hayes name, for long enough that whatever was real about him would surface naturally. They had a consultant friend named David Park, no relation to their assumed surname, which Carol noted with a brief dry smile, who ran executive leadership retreats and who agreed, after a long private conversation with Richard, to provide the official cover story. The retreat was real. The paperwork was real. The rationale given to Ethan, that a period of immersive community integration and reduced technological access was a recognized leadership development practice endorsed by half a dozen business schools and the particular consultant they had hired, was real enough that Ethan could not easily argue against it without arguing against the principle of leadership development itself, which he had publicly endorsed more than once in company documents. Richard built the trap with a precision that would have impressed him if he had been on the other side of it. Ethan argued against it anyway, for 2 weeks, with the focused persistence of a person who has his father's stubbornness and his mother's logical rigor and is genuinely annoyed. He did not understand why he needed to be in rural North Carolina for 6 weeks when he had a company to help run and a life in Atlanta and a relationship with Vanessa that was at a stage requiring presence and attention. He said this. Richard said the retreat would be valuable. Carol said she thought the break would do him good. Ethan said the timing was inconvenient. Richard said leadership development was never convenient by definition. Ethan said he had never heard that particular definition of leadership development. Richard said he was confident the experience would change that. This went on for 2 weeks. Ethan lost, which almost never happened to him and which he blamed entirely on his father, not yet having understood that his mother had been the architect of the argument the whole time and that his father had simply been the face of it. He drove to Clover Ridge on a Wednesday morning in early November in a rented pickup truck that was 10 years old and had a Pine Air freshener hanging from the mirror that someone had left there and that filled the cab with a smell so aggressively synthetic that it made everything feel slightly surreal. He had a duffel bag that was genuinely not designed for 6 weeks of rural living. He had his phone, which he had already been informed would have limited reception in parts of the area. He had his wallet, which contained a Visa card loaded with a monthly allowance that his parents had described as sufficient for basic needs, and which Ethan was rapidly calculating was going to require a significant adjustment to his daily habits. He was 32 hours from being genuinely humbled by a grocery bill. He did not know this yet. He drove through the mountain roads with the windows down despite the cold because the Pine Air freshener was winning and he needed air that was actually real, and when the first view of Clover Ridge came into sight around a long curve, a cluster of low buildings along a main road, mountains on 3 sides, a church steeple catching the late morning light, he stopped the truck on the shoulder for a moment and just looked at it. He could not have told you why he stopped. He just did. Richard and Carol had arrived 4 days earlier and were already, with the efficiency of 2 people who had built an empire from nothing, fully embedded in the fabric of Clover Ridge. They had introduced themselves to their neighbors on both sides with homemade banana bread, Carol's recipe, the one she made when she wanted to make an impression without appearing to be making an impression. They had attended the Sunday service at the smaller of the 2 churches, which had 63 members and a choir of 8 and a pastor named Reverend Willis who shook hands like he meant it. They had gone to the farmer's market on Saturday morning and bought local honey and a winter squash and a small pot of rosemary from a woman named Della who had been selling plants from the same spot at the market for 22 years and who told Carol within 10 minutes that she was going to love Clover Ridge because you could tell within 30 seconds of meeting a person whether they were real or not, and Carol was clearly real. Carol thanked her and meant it. They had let their bodies relax into the pace of the place, which was slower and more physical and more oriented toward the actual present moment than anything they had lived in for decades. Richard weeded the garden at the rental house. Carol made soup from scratch on a Tuesday afternoon for no reason other than that it was cold outside and she felt like it. They sat on the porch swing in the evenings and watched the light change over the mountains and did not talk about Hayes technology once. Richard said on the 3rd evening, sitting with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands and the mountains turning the color of old copper in the last light, I forgot what this felt like. Carol did not answer. She put her hand over his and they sat like that until the light was gone. 2 people who had built everything together, sitting quietly in the middle of a plan they were not entirely sure about, in a town that did not know who they were, feeling more like themselves than they had in a very long time. The bakery was the first thing in Clover Ridge that genuinely got Ethan's attention. He drove past it his first morning in town. It was called Sunrise, and it sat on the main road between the hardware store and the post office, a small storefront with warm light in the windows and hand-lettered signage in the door, and the smell reached him through the open truck window and stopped him mid-thought. It was the smell of brown butter and warm cardamom and something underneath that he could not identify, but that was distinctly honest, the way food smells when it is made by someone who is paying attention. He did not stop the truck. He was on his way to meet his contact at the retreat organization and he was already running slightly behind. But he noticed the bakery. He noticed it the way you notice something that you will remember later, even if you do not know yet that you are going to remember it. He went back the next morning at 6:15, which was 15 minutes after he had woken up and approximately 3 hours before he would normally have been functional in Atlanta. The town was quiet. There was frost on the cars parked along the main road. His breath made visible clouds in the cold air. The bakery was open, the lights were on and the door was unlocked and a small handwritten sign in the window said, in careful blue ink, "Open 5:30." And when he pushed the door open the warmth and the smell hit him simultaneously and he stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside. The woman behind the counter was wiping down the glass display case with a white cloth, and she did not look up immediately. She had dark hair pulled back in a simple knot, an apron dusted with flour at the center, and the focused, unhurried quality of someone in the middle of a task they do not intend to rush. The case held croissants and several kinds of bread and what appeared to be a layered honey cake on a stand with a handwritten label card leaning against it. When she did look up, she said, "Morning. What can I get you?" Not in an unfriendly way. In the way of someone who has been up since 4:30 and has already done several hours of real work and is not inclined to perform warmth she doesn't currently feel but is entirely willing to provide good service. He looked at the honey cake. He said, "What is that?" She said, "Cardamom honey cake. It's the weekend special." He said, "It's Wednesday." She said, "I know. I made it early because I wanted to see if the cardamom ratio was right before I put it on the weekend menu." He said, "And?" She said, "You tell me." She cut him a piece and slid it across the counter on a small plate. He ate it standing there. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "This is the best thing I've eaten in months." She looked at him with a slight tilt of her head and said, "That either means the cake is exceptional or your life has been deeply unexamined." He laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that gets away from you before you can decide whether to let it out. He came back the next morning. And the morning after that. And the morning after that. Her name was Maggie Torres and she was 31 years old and she had, by any objective measure, given up a significant portion of the life she had planned for herself and rebuilt something real in its place, which is harder than it sounds and more meaningful than most people give it credit for. She had studied English literature at UNC Asheville. She had loved it with the specific passionate commitment of a person who has found the subject that organizes everything they feel about the world, and had moved to Charlotte after graduation with reasonable plans and reasonable prospects. She had a marketing job at a mid-sized firm that was not her calling but was solid and paid well and left her enough space to read and write and live the life that exists around the edges of a career. She had an apartment with a good window in the kitchen. She had a group of friends she saw on weekends. She had, carefully and privately and without making a production of it, a whole life. Her father, George Torres, had been diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's 4.5 years before this story begins. He was 58 years old at diagnosis, which is young for the disease and particularly cruel in its timing. He had just retired after 30 years as an elementary school principal in Clover Ridge, a man who had spent his professional life organizing the early education of several hundred children and who had been genuinely beloved in a way that teachers and administrators rarely are. Not because he was easy or lenient but because he was fair and he was consistent and he paid attention. He had planned to travel in retirement. He had a list. He had booked 2 trips already. The diagnosis arrived 3 months into his retirement, and the trip stayed booked for almost a year before Maggie quietly canceled them without telling him. She came back to Clover Ridge intending to stay for 3 months to help him settle into the adjustments the disease would require and to arrange the home care and the medical management and the practical architecture of a different kind of life. 3 months became 6. 6 became a year. By the end of the first year, she had taken over the bakery, which had been her father's, a place he had run as a hobby in semi-retirement and which would have closed without someone to run it, and converted it into a real operation. She was not a baker by training. She was a person who paid attention to what she was doing and who understood quality and who worked hard enough and long enough that the gap between where she started and where she needed to be closed faster than anyone, including herself, expected. She hired one part-time employee to help in the mornings. She experimented with the menu. She developed a Saturday special, named each week after whatever she was reading, that people drove from Asheville to buy. The cardamom honey cake had been named for a Wendell Berry poem about attention and patience and the dignity of small, real things. Ethan did not know this when he ate it standing at the counter. But it was fitting. She woke at 4:30 every morning. She mixed dough by hand for the first hour because she liked the physical honesty of it, the way the work was real and gave you a visible result and did not lie to you about whether you had done it right. She carried her father's breakfast over at 7 before she opened the bakery, checked his medications, talked with him for 30 minutes about whatever he had been reading or watching or thinking about, and then came back to open the doors at 5:30. In the evenings after she closed, she read or called the friends who had waited patiently in Charlotte while she did not come back and who had mostly stopped asking when she would. She did not complain about any of it. She was not a person who performed sacrifice for an audience. She had made a choice and she lived it without commentary, which is actually one of the more difficult human skills and one of the rarest. When Ethan started coming in every morning, she registered his presence the way she registered most things, practically and without drama. He was clearly not from the area. His clothes were wrong for the cold in the specific way that happens when someone has money but has bought practical clothes in a hurry and bought them from the wrong stores. He asked good questions. He listened to the answers. He ordered the same coffee every day, black, with a small cup of water on the side, which she had never seen before and found mildly curious, and he ate whatever she put in front of him with the focused attention of someone who has recently discovered that food made by someone who cares about it is categorically different from food made by someone who doesn't. He was, she thought in the second week, probably worth talking to. She was selective about who she gave her full attention to. Time was not something she had in excess. The conversation that changed the quality of what was between them happened on a Thursday morning in the third week of November when Ethan arrived at the bakery to find that one of the supply boxes from that morning's delivery was blocking the side entrance and was too heavy for Maggie's part-time employee, who had called in sick, to move on her own. Ethan helped without being asked, which was noted. He was bad at it. He clearly had not regularly lifted anything heavier than a laptop bag in some time, and Maggie told him so, which made him laugh rather than bristle, which was also noted. They stacked the boxes and he stayed and drank his coffee at the counter while she worked, and they talked the way people talk when they are not performing for each other, in short honest exchanges with actual pauses between them instead of the constant maintenance conversation that passes for connection in most social situations. She told him about her father without being prompted, not dramatically but matter-of-factly, the way you talk about something you have lived with long enough that it has lost its capacity to destabilize you and has become simply part of the landscape of your life. He listened without jumping to fix anything or redirect to a brighter topic, which she found, privately, unusual and valuable. He came to the Saturday market that weekend. He found her booth. She sold loaves and pastries alongside the plant vendor and the honey seller, and helped her carry her folding tables from her van without asking if she needed help, which she did and would not have requested. She introduced him to Della, the plant seller, who assessed him in approximately 4 seconds and said to Maggie, after he had moved a table and was out of earshot, "City boy. Good eyes though." Maggie said, "I know." Della said, "Bring him to the market again." Maggie said she would not make any promises. She brought him the next Saturday. He met her father, George, on a Sunday afternoon 3.5 weeks into his time in Clover Ridge. It happened naturally. Maggie mentioned she was bringing soup over after she closed the bakery, and Ethan, who had nothing else to do that afternoon and was discovering that having nothing else to do was something he had never previously experienced and was not sure how to navigate, asked if he could come. She looked at him for a moment and then said yes, with the pragmatic openness of someone who does not manufacture obstacles when they are not necessary. George Torres was sitting in a good chair by the front window with a book open in his lap and the particular expression of a man who is used to being independent and is managing the adjustments to that independence with dignity and not a great deal of self-pity, which takes more strength than most people understand. His hands trembled slightly when he reached out to shake Ethan's hand. He looked at Ethan for the 4-second assessment period that Ethan was by now beginning to recognize as something the people of Clover Ridge did instead of small talk, and then he said, "Sit down. Maggie tells me you're from Atlanta." Ethan said he was. George said, "What kind of work?" Ethan had his cover story ready. He said his family had been in technology but that they'd recently hit some significant financial difficulties and he was taking time to recalibrate. George said, Then he said, "You read Elmore Leonard?" Ethan said he had not. George said, "Fix that." Then he talked about Elmore Leonard for 40 minutes with the engaged, opinionated specificity of someone who has read widely and thought about what he has read and is delighted to find someone willing to listen. Ethan listened. Not politely. Actually. He asked questions that showed he was following the argument. George told Maggie later, when Ethan was helping her with the soup bowls in the kitchen, he's worth talking to. Maggie said, I know. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment right now that says, I am still here. Let us see who is truly following this story, because what is about to happen changes everything for all three of them in ways that none of them were prepared for. The next part of this story is the part that made me stop and sit with it for a long time before I could write about it. Stay with me. It is important to understand what Ethan Hayes experienced in Clover Ridge, because it is the part of this story that does not have a cynical explanation and that is therefore, in some ways, the most important part. He was not performing. He was not on a strategic mission to find a suitable romantic partner. He was not, in those early weeks, even particularly happy. He was disoriented and slightly resentful and genuinely out of his depth in ways that were unfamiliar and uncomfortable. But he was also, for the first time in years, in an environment where no one knew who he was, where no one was calibrating their behavior toward him based on a calculation about what knowing him was worth, where the people around him were relating to him based entirely on what he did and said and offered in the actual present moment. And that environment, which should have felt impoverished compared to the world he had come from, felt instead like being able to breathe all the way down for the first time in a very long time. He started doing things he had not done in years. He took long walks in the morning before the bakery opened, through the farm roads outside of town where the cold air had a clean mineral quality and the mountains were close enough that you could see individual trees on the ridgelines. He fixed a fence post on the rental property's back boundary with a set of tools he found in the shed, badly and then less badly, because there was no one to call and no one to watch and the fence needed fixing and he was there. He read 3 novels in the first month, which was more than he had read for pleasure in the previous 2 years. He started sleeping 8 hours a night, which he had not done since college, and woke feeling like a different person. He was becoming, slowly and without any strategy, someone more fully himself. With Maggie, it grew the way real things grow, through small repeated acts of honest attention rather than through dramatic declarations or manufactured moments. He noticed the way she talked about literature with the same precision she applied to the flavor profile of a bread, not casually, not for effect, but because she had thought about it carefully and the words she used were the right words. He noticed the way she managed the bakery not just as a business but as a space she was responsible for. The freshness of the flowers on the counter changed twice a week, the music was always considered, the temperature was always exactly right, because she understood that the small things were not small if they were the things people felt first. He noticed the way she looked at her father, not with grief on the surface, because she kept grief private, but with a quality of attention that was the most loving thing he had seen in years. Complete, unperformed, consistent attention. The kind that does not calculate the cost. For her part, Maggie was careful. She had been careful for a long time about letting people close, not because she had been particularly hurt in the past but because her life required a level of energy and focus that did not leave a large margin for managing other people's instability. She was selective. She was honest about being selective. But Ethan was passing tests he did not know he was taking, in the way that only genuinely good people pass tests they do not know they are taking, not by performing the right answers but by simply being consistent in the way he showed up. He did not try to impress her. He did not oversell himself. When he did not know something, he said so. When she challenged him on something, he thought about it rather than defending himself reflexively. He laughed easily and specifically, at actual things rather than in the general performative way of people who have learned that laughter is socially useful. The evening that shifted something irreversibly happened in late November, a Tuesday. He had stayed late at the bakery helping after a catering order that had been larger than expected and that had kept Maggie working past 7. When the last tray was cleaned and the last container stacked, they sat on the back step of the bakery with cups of tea in the cold dark, the town quiet around them, the mountains somewhere in the darkness beyond the tree line. He said, without particularly planning to say it, I don't know when I last felt like myself." She looked at him sideways. She said, "What version of yourself?" He thought about that for a moment. He said, "Just, myself. Without all the layers." She said, "That's the version I've been talking to." He looked at her. He said, very quietly, "I know." She looked back at the dark outline of the mountains. She said, "Good." That was all. But something settled into place in both of them that night that was not going to unsettle easily. Meanwhile, 60 yards away in the practical reality of the town, Richard and Carol were watching. Not constantly and not intrusively, they were not surveilling Ethan, they were simply living in the same small town where information moved through conversation the way water moves through soil, slowly and thoroughly and in every direction. They heard from Martha's neighbor about the young man from the retreat program who had become a daily presence at the Sunrise Bakery. They heard from Della at the farmer's market, who did not know who they were, that the boy from Atlanta had come back 2 Saturdays in a row and had good eyes and didn't make a production of himself. They walked past the bakery on a Saturday morning at the market and saw Ethan and Maggie at her table, Ethan holding a crate of bread loaves with the concentrated expression of someone performing a simple task with more care than it technically required, Maggie talking to a customer with one hand gesturing and the other resting on the table edge and laughing at something the customer said with a full, unguarded laugh that reached her eyes without passing through any calculation first. Carol watched for a moment. Then she looked away. She felt something in her chest that she could not have named precisely, relief and worry in approximately equal parts, mixed with the particular quality of emotion that belongs specifically to parents who can see something their child needs and cannot give it to them directly. Richard put his arm around her. Neither of them said anything. They kept walking. Ethan told Maggie about the financial difficulties in the first week of December, on a morning when the conversation had turned to the town and what it meant to make a life in a place like Clover Ridge as opposed to a city. He said his family had built something significant in the technology sector but that there had been serious problems and that the stability he had grown up with was no longer what it had been. He watched her face as he said it. She did not flinch. She did not lean in with the particular quality of heightened interest that money, even its loss, produces in people who care about it. She nodded slowly and said, "That's hard. Especially when you've built something and then it starts to feel like it might not be solid." Then she said, "But money is strange. It makes people feel safe, but it's not the same thing as safety. My dad always said the only things that hold when everything else goes are the things you did for someone else when no one was watching." She paused. She smiled in a way that held both grief and love at the same time, the particular smile of someone who is quoting a person they are in the process of losing. He says things like that a lot these days. I think the Parkinson's is making him more poetic. Ethan did not respond immediately. He was processing the specific texture of sitting across from someone who had just said the truest thing he had heard in years and had said it as if it were obvious and not exceptional. He drove back to his rental house that evening along the road that wound through the pine trees and pulled over once to sit in the dark with the windows down, the cold air coming in, the smell of pine and earth and something clean, and he thought about Vanessa for the first time in weeks. He thought about the quality of their conversations. He thought about what it felt like to be in Vanessa's presence versus what it felt like to be in Maggie's presence, and the comparison was specific and honest and not flattering to the life he had been living. He did not feel self-righteous about it. He felt something closer to grief, the quiet, clear-eyed kind that comes from seeing something true about yourself and knowing you cannot unsee it. Vanessa Cole was not a passive person. She was someone who had learned early that information was a resource and that the people who moved most effectively through the world were the ones who had it and used it. She had contacts at Hayes Technology. She had contacts in Atlanta press circles. She had, and she would not have described it this way but it was accurate, a talent for assembling partial information into a complete picture and then acting on the picture before anyone else had seen it. She had known something was wrong with the timeline and the explanations she was getting from Ethan for 6 weeks. The financial difficulty rumor had reached her through 2 separate channels by mid-November and she had assessed it not as a rumor but as something requiring investigation. By the end of November, she knew approximately where Ethan was and why, though not the full architecture of the plan. By early December, she had enough. She decided to go. She arrived in Clover Ridge on a Friday afternoon in the second week of December in a car that was categorically wrong for the mountain roads and the weather and the town in every way that a car can be wrong. She parked on the main road and walked to the Sunrise Bakery because she had done enough research to know that if Ethan was anywhere on a Friday afternoon, it was likely there. She walked in at 3 in the afternoon, when the bakery was in its quiet between lunch and close period, and Maggie was the only person present, wiping down the counter. Vanessa looked at the room briefly and then looked at Maggie and said, without much preamble, "I'm looking for Ethan Hayes." She said the name with the precise emphasis of someone who knows the name carries weight and intends to use that weight. Maggie looked at her. She said, steadily, "I don't know anyone by that name." It was the first completely true thing she had said that afternoon that contained a lie in it, because she knew the first name and she knew the face that went with it, and the name Hayes sat in her chest with an unfamiliar weight the moment it was said. Vanessa smiled the particular smile of someone who has information the other person does not yet have and is planning to change that. She said she would wait. She sat at the corner table. Maggie went back to her work. The bakery was quiet except for the sound of the cloth on the counter and the low movement of the December wind outside the window and the specific tension of two people in a small room who are not speaking and are both very aware of it. Ethan arrived 23 minutes later, pushing the door open with one shoulder, already starting to say something about whether there was any of the rye bread left from that morning. He saw Vanessa. He stopped. The door closed behind him. The color in his face did something complex and specific that Maggie observed from behind the counter with the full attention she gave to things that mattered. It was not guilt. It was the expression of a person who has just watched two separate parts of their life enter the same physical space and who has approximately 3 seconds to calculate what that means and has arrived at the answer too fast and does not like it. Vanessa stood. She said his full name. Ethan Hayes. She said, "I found you." Then she turned to look at Maggie, very deliberately, and she said, "Did he tell you who he is? Did he tell you about Hayes Technology? Did he tell you that his father is worth $2 billion and stepped back from the company not because of health but because he and his wife decided to run a little test on the people in their son's life?" She had her phone out. She put it on the counter in front of Maggie. There were photographs, Richard Hayes at industry events, the Hayes Technology headquarters in Atlanta, press coverage of the step-back announcement with financial commentary, a Forbes profile photo that was undeniable. She said, "That couple calling themselves the Parks. The retired teachers. That's Richard and Carol Hayes." The bakery was completely quiet. Outside, the December wind moved through the street with the particular quality of winter wind in mountain towns, low and constant and indifferent to whatever is happening among the people it passes through. Maggie looked at the phone. She looked at the photographs with the same measured attention she gave to everything, reading them rather than reacting to them, which took approximately 45 seconds that felt considerably longer to everyone in the room. Then she set the phone carefully back on the counter and said, in a voice that was very steady in the way a person's voice is steady when they are holding themselves together through sheer discipline and they know that if any of it shifts they will not be all right, "I think both of you need to leave." Ethan said her name. She said, "Please." He left. Vanessa said something on her way out the door, something about wasted time and obvious conclusions, that landed in the empty bakery like something thrown carelessly and then left. Then the door closed and Maggie was alone. She locked the front door. She turned off the display lights. She sat down on the floor of her own bakery, her back against the glass display case, and she pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and she cried. Not loudly. Not dramatically. The way people cry when they are genuinely hurt and they are doing it in private and they do not intend for anyone to hear, controlled and thorough and deeply felt and absolutely real. Ethan sat in his car in the parking lot outside his rental house for 2 hours and 17 minutes. He knew this because he checked his phone at the beginning and the end, and in between he sat with the windows up and the engine off in the December cold, and he thought. He was not a person who did this often, who sat with something difficult without moving to resolve it, but he recognized, in the way that people recognize when they are genuinely in unfamiliar territory, that this was a situation that required sitting with rather than immediately acting on. He had lied to her. Not in the way Vanessa had framed it, which was reductive and motivated. But he had lied to her. He had built a version of himself that was true in everything except the most basic structural facts of his life, and he had let her care about that version, and she had. And now those facts had arrived in her bakery in the form of a woman who had put them on a phone screen on her counter, and nothing about that was fixable with the right phrasing. He called his mother. Carol picked up on the second ring, as she always did for Ethan, as she had done every time he called his whole life regardless of what else was happening. Before she could say anything he said, "She knows. Maggie knows." The silence on the other end lasted 3 full seconds. Then Carol said, "Ethan, I'm so sorry." Not a preamble. Not an explanation. Just the straight core of it. And the specific way she said it, not defensively, not with the impulse to manage the situation, just with the clean weight of genuine regret, was both the worst thing he had heard all day and the most honest. Richard and Carol came to his door that night. They came as themselves, Carol in her actual coat, Richard without the subtle adjustments he had made to his appearance for the Clover Ridge role. They sat in Ethan's small rented living room, which smelled of the pine cleaner the property owner used on the floors and had a radiator that knocked intermittently in the corner, and Richard told Ethan the whole truth. He started at the dinner party in September. He told him what Carol had heard. He told him about Vanessa's words in the hallway. He told him about the plan, the step back, the financial rumor, the move to Clover Ridge as the parks, the consultant cover for the retreat. He told him why. He told him that the reason behind all of it was love and fear in combination, which is one of the most powerful and most dangerous combinations a parent can feel, and that they had let it lead them somewhere they should have examined more carefully before they went. Ethan listened without interrupting, which cost him something because listening without interrupting when he was angry was not a skill that came naturally to him. When his father finished, the room was quiet for a moment. The radiator knocked. Then Ethan said, "You were trying to protect me." Richard said, "Yes." Ethan said, "You didn't trust me to protect myself." That sentence did not land like an accusation. It landed like the specific, clean kind of truth that doesn't need to be loud to be devastating. Richard opened his mouth. Then he closed it. Carol looked at her hands in her lap. She did not look at Richard. She did not look at Ethan. She looked at her hands, which were the hands that had kneaded bread dough and written business plans and changed Ethan's diapers and held his face when he was sick as a child and signed the documents that kept Hayes Technology running through the hardest years, and which were now perfectly still in her lap while she sat with what her son had just said. Richard said, finally and quietly, "You're right." Not as a concession in an argument. As an acknowledgement of a fact. "You're right, Ethan. And I'm sorry." Carol looked up then. She said, "So am I. For all of it." Ethan looked at his father for a long time. He looked at his mother. He said, "I need to talk to her." They nodded. They left without trying to manage what came next, which was itself a form of trust they owed him and were only now getting to. He went to the bakery before it opened the next morning. He knocked on the side entrance at 5:15 in the dark and the cold, in a jacket that was not warm enough because he had not thought to put on the right coat. He heard movement inside. Then silence. He knocked again, not urgently but persistently, with the quality of knocking that communicates that the person on the other side of the door is not going to be able to outlast it. He said, through the door, "I'm not asking for anything right now. I'm not asking you to forgive anything. I just want to explain what I actually lied about, so that you know the difference between what was real and what wasn't. That's all. After that you can tell me to leave and I will." A long pause. The kind that means something is being decided. Then the door opened. She stood in the doorway in her 4:30 apron with flour on her forearm and her hair still in the knot from the night before because she had been here since 4 working through something that required her hands to be busy. She did not invite him in. She stood in the doorway and he stood in the cold and he talked. He told her the truth in the order in which it mattered. He told her that his parents were real people who had genuinely built their company from nothing and whose fear for him was genuine even if their method was wrong. He told her that his confusion about being seen as himself rather than as a name was real and not a manufactured emotion deployed to manipulate her. He told her that every single thing he had said to her directly, in the bakery, at the market, at her father's house, on the back step in the dark with the cups of tea, was true. He said, the lie was structural. It was about the external facts. It was not in anything I said to you. I know that doesn't fix it. I'm not saying it does. I'm just saying I need you to know the difference. He stopped. She was looking at him in the way she looked at things she was reading carefully. He said, you told me money comes and goes but character stays. I believed you when you said it. I still do. She did not say anything for what felt like a long time. Then she said, go home, Ethan. I need to think. He nodded. He turned and walked back to his truck in the dark and the cold. She closed the door and stood inside it with her hand on the wood and her eyes closed and stood there for a very long time. She took 5 days. She did not contact him. She opened the bakery every morning, made the bread, served the customers, carried breakfast to her father, managed the supply order, closed up in the evening. She did all of it with the same consistency she always brought to it, because her life did not stop when it was difficult and she had never expected it to. But in the spaces between, in the first hour of mixing dough when there was nothing but her and the work in the dark outside the windows, she turned the whole thing over and examined it from every angle she could reach. She thought about the morning he had helped with the supply boxes without being asked and without mentioning it afterward to anyone. She thought about the evening at her father's house when he had sat for 2 hours talking about Elmore Leonard with the genuine engagement of someone who finds a person worth listening to and responds to that finding by listening. She thought about the night on the back step when he had said, I don't know when I last felt like myself, in a voice that did not contain any performance of vulnerability, which is the only kind of vulnerability that is actually vulnerable. She thought about the way he had never once, in any of their conversations, tried to impress her with anything other than his actual thoughts. She thought about all of it and then she thought about the phone on the counter and the names she had not known and the parents who had moved into her town under false names and the whole invisible architecture of a plan she had been living inside of without knowing it existed. She went to see Carol. This surprised everyone who heard about it, including Carol. She asked Martha's neighbor where the Parks were staying, the couple from Knoxville, the retired teachers, and the neighbor, who knew everything about everyone in Clover Ridge and was not particularly discreet about it, told her the white clapboard house on the east edge of town with the garden. She knocked on a Tuesday afternoon. Carol answered. Maggie looked at her for a moment and then said, I think you and I need to have a conversation. Without your son or your husband. Carol stepped back from the door. She opened it wider. She said, yes. Come in. They sat at the kitchen table with tea that both of them actually drank. Carol told her everything, in the order it happened and without managing it for palatability. She told her about the dinner party. She told her what she had heard Vanessa say, word for word, without inflection or editorial. She told her about the plan and its stages and the reasoning behind each of them. She told her about the flaw in the reasoning, the fundamental error of taking away Maggie's right to make an informed choice, and she said it plainly, without deflecting the responsibility onto fear or love or intention, because she was a person who had built an entire company on the principle that identifying what went wrong was more useful than defending why it happened. She said, we thought we were testing whether you could love Ethan without knowing who he was. But that was arrogant and it was wrong. We took away your ability to choose with full information. And I have thought about that every single day since Ethan called me. She stopped. She looked at Maggie across the table with the direct, unguarded look of someone who is done managing the impression they make and is simply being seen. I'm sorry, Maggie. For all of it. Maggie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he's very much like you. Carol looked up. Maggie said, not in the obvious ways. But in the way he leads with what he believes rather than what's convenient. It gets him in trouble. But it's rare. She picked up her tea. She held it in both hands. She said, the part of this whole thing that I keep coming back to is not the deception. It's what was true inside it. Because something was. Carol did not say anything. Her eyes were bright. She did not look away. Maggie said, I am not okay with what happened. I want to be clear about that. I am not going to pretend it was fine or that the intentions made it acceptable. She set down her tea. But I've spent the last 5 days trying to find one thing he said to me that was false. And I can't. She was quiet for a moment. Not one thing. Carol pressed her lips together. Outside the window, the December light was thin and clear on the mountain. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Maggie said, he needs to understand that I get to know the truth going forward. All of it. Every time. Carol said, yes. Maggie said, and so do you and Richard. Carol said, yes. Maggie said, good. She finished her tea. She thanked Carol for being honest. She put on her coat. She went home. 3 days later, she opened the bakery on a Thursday morning and Ethan was outside at 5:30 in the cold dark, hands in the pockets of a jacket that was still not warm enough, not knocking, just standing at the door the way a person stands when they have decided to be somewhere and are not certain of their welcome but are certain of their decision. She unlocked the door. She did not say anything. He came in. She handed him an apron and pointed to the sourdough on the counter that needed its final fold before it went into the proofing basket. He put on the apron without a word. He folded the dough with more care than the previous attempts, which she noticed but did not comment on. They worked in silence for an hour and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the particular quality of silence between two people who have said the important things and are now simply in the same space being real, which is its own form of communication. Then she said, not looking up from what she was doing, you tell me the truth from here. Everything. No versions. He said, yes. She said, I mean it. He said, I know you do. She looked up. She nodded once. Outside the window, the main road of Clover Ridge was beginning to show in the first pale light of a December morning. A truck went by. Someone's porch light was on. The town was waking up around them, quiet and real and indifferent to their particular drama, which was exactly right. There is a kind of learning that only happens when you have been genuinely wrong about something that matters and you know it and you do not look away from it. It is different from intellectual learning or strategic recalibration. It is the kind that sits in your body and changes the quality of how you think about yourself and what you are capable of. Richard Hayes experienced this kind of learning in Clover Ridge in December, and it was, he would say later, one of the most significant experiences of his adult life, not because it was pleasant, but because it was necessary and it was honest and it arrived from a direction he had not expected. He and Carol sat on the porch swing most evenings, when the cold was manageable, and talked. Not about the company. Not about what came next. About the actual things, the fear they had been carrying for Ethan for years and how that fear had expressed itself in control rather than trust. About the moments in their own lives when someone had trusted them and what that trust had done for them. About their parents, who had also feared for them and had handled that fear differently, Min and Lynn Gwyn, who had watched Carol move to Atlanta and build something unknown without interfering, who had called every week but never arrived uninvited, James and Dorothy Hayes, who had told Richard once, the year before he started the company, that they did not entirely understand what he was doing but that they had always trusted his judgment and they were not going to stop now. What had that trust cost those parents? What had it required of them? And what had it given to their children? Richard sat with those questions on the porch of a rented house in Clover Ridge and felt the weight of them with a specificity and honesty that the pace of his regular life did not usually allow. He said one evening, we went to Clover Ridge to find out if someone could love Ethan without the money. But I think what we were really doing was trying to control something we couldn't control. Carol said, we were scared. He said, we were. But fear that doesn't know its own name makes bad decisions. She was quiet for a long moment. The porch swing moved slightly in the evening air. Then she said, she's good, Richard. He said, I know. She said, she's better than the plan deserved. He said, I know that too. They sat there until the last light was gone from the mountains. Then Carol said, with a laugh that came from somewhere deep and genuine and surprised her a little when it arrived, we ran an undercover operation with a $2 billion cover story, and the person who saw through all of it and taught us something is running a bakery on Main Street. Richard shook his head. He laughed too. Sometimes the lesson comes from exactly the direction your pride would least choose. They apologized to Maggie. Formally and specifically and in person, at the kitchen table of the white clapboard house, with no press, no documentation, no management of how it would look. Richard said what he had done and why it was wrong. Carol said the same. They did not qualify it with intention. They did not ask for forgiveness in the same breath as the apology, which is the move of people who want the emotional transaction to close quickly rather than the move of people who genuinely mean it. They said what they had to say and they waited. Maggie listened. Then she said, I believe you. Both of you. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, just raise better boundaries next time. He's a grown man. Richard laughed before he could stop it. He said, you're right. She said, I know. And that, with the particular completeness of things that don't need more words added to them, was that. 6 months after Clover Ridge, in the early summer, Ethan Hayes proposed to Maggie Torres on the back step of the Sunrise Bakery. Not at a rooftop restaurant with a view. Not with a photographer hidden nearby. On the same wooden step where they had first sat in the cold with cups of tea and the mountains in the dark, where he had first said something true without planning to. He had with him a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, Dorothy Hayes, who had worn it for 51 years and who had given it to Carol the year before she passed with the specific instruction that Carol would know when the right time was to pass it on. Carol had kept it in a blue velvet box in the back of her jewelry drawer for 7 years, and when Ethan had called her from Clover Ridge 3 weeks after opening the door Thursday morning and said in a voice that was quieter than she expected, Mom, I think I know, she had known exactly what he meant. She had gone to the drawer that same evening. The ring was simple and old and not entirely symmetrical, and Maggie looked at it for a long moment when he opened the box. She looked at it the way she looked at things that were real, carefully and without rushing the recognition. Then she looked at him. She said, yes. Obviously. He laughed. She laughed. George Torres, who had been told not to watch from the back window of the house next door where he had agreed to be that afternoon with Maggie's friend Dana, watched from the back window of the house next door and did not try to make it look like he wasn't, and when Maggie looked up and saw him he raised his coffee cup at her and she shook her head in the specific way of a daughter who is not actually surprised. The wedding was in December, back in Clover Ridge, in the community hall that smelled of pine and old wood and the particular warmth of a building that has held a lot of gatherings over a lot of years and absorbed some of the quality of all of them. They had the number of guests that both of them wanted, which was enough to feel like a celebration and not so many that it became a performance. Maggie's friends from Charlotte were there, the ones who had waited through 4 years of absence with the particular grace of people who understand that sometimes a friend's life pulls them somewhere necessary and you wait and you stay available and you do not make it about you. Della from the farmer's market was there with her husband. Reverend Willis, who had come to know Richard and Carol in their few months as the Parks and who had known the truth since approximately November without saying anything to anyone, which was a testament to a kind of pastoral discretion that is rarer than it should be, officiated. George Torres sat in a good chair in the front row. He had dressed carefully and he was steady that day, which was not always the case, and Maggie noticed it when she walked in and looked at him first, and he looked back at her with the expression of a man who knows he is watching the most important moment he will ever sit in the front row of. Richard and Carol sat in the second row. Carol was wearing a blue dress she had bought in Asheville the week before, and Richard was in a suit, and his face had the particular quality of a man who has stopped trying to manage what he is feeling and has simply given it permission to be visible. He cried when Ethan and Maggie stood at the front of the room and said the old words that people have always said when they are trying to make a promise permanent. He did not try to stop it. Carol leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The hall was very quiet in the moments that mattered, and then it was not quiet at all, and outside the December mountains held the light for as long as they could and then let it go into the dark the way they always do. What stayed with everyone who was there, not as a story they would tell later but as a feeling they carried, was not the wealth behind the family or the elaborate deception that had preceded the moment or the dramatic arc of the 6 months before the wedding. What stayed was something simpler and harder to put into words. It was the quality of two people who had found each other under circumstances that could have broken the thing before it started, and who had each made the harder choice, Maggie to open the door, Ethan to stand outside it long enough, Richard and Carol to get out of the way, and had arrived here, in this room, in this December, in this specific community hall in a small North Carolina town, real and present and without performance. Richard gave an interview 2 years later, one of the very few he gave in his career that was personal rather than professional, to a journalist who had been told the basic outline of the Clover Ridge story and wanted to understand it. He was characteristically precise and unexpectedly candid. He said the smartest professional decision he had ever made was starting Hayes Technology with nothing, because starting with nothing had given him a relationship to what things actually cost that he had never lost. He said the most important personal decision he had ever made was getting out of his son's way when he finally understood that getting in the way was hurting them both. The journalist asked him what he had wanted to find in Clover Ridge, really, when they had made the plan. He said, "We went looking for a woman who would love Ethan without his last name." The journalist asked if he found her. Richard said, "We found something better." The journalist asked what. He thought for a moment and then said, "We found a woman who could see him. Who he actually was. Not the name, not the money, not the version of himself he presents in a boardroom. The actual person." He paused. "The two things sound the same. They are not the same." He said, "Seeing someone is harder. It requires you to actually be seen back." He looked at the journalist. He said, "Ethan learned that in Clover Ridge. Eventually, Carol and I learned it too. Just slower, and with considerably more embarrassment, which was probably appropriate. We have come a long way together in this story today. And before we close, we want to sit here for a moment with you and ask you something real. Because this story is not just about billionaires and disguises and a bakery in North Carolina. It is about something that most of us have either felt or feared or both. If you were Maggie Torres, if you were the person who had given years to caring for someone you loved, who had built something real and good out of what you had available, who had let someone in carefully and with intention, and then you found out that the person you had let in had been less than fully honest about who they were, and that the people who loved them had been watching without your knowledge, what would you do? Would you open the door at 5:30 in the morning? Would you hand someone an apron and tell them to fold the dough? Or would you decide that the deception was the defining thing, that the structure of what had been built was too compromised to continue, that you had given enough of yourself already and you were not going to give this too? There is no wrong answer. But we want you to sit with the question, because it is the kind of question that tells you something about yourself that is worth knowing. And think also about Richard and Carol. Think about the fear behind the plan. Think about the last time you let your fear for someone you love, a child, a partner, a friend, make you reach for control when what they actually needed from you was trust. Most of us have done it. The scale is different. The consequence is different. But the fear and the impulse behind it are human and almost universal. And the question of how we learn from it, not how we excuse it, but how we genuinely grow from it, is one of the most important questions a person can sit with. Maggie Torres opened the door because she had looked, as carefully as she looked at everything, at who Ethan was in the moments that cannot be performed. And she had decided those moments were the truth. That is not a decision made from naivety. It is a decision made from a particular kind of courage, the courage that says, I know this is complicated and I know I was hurt and I know the ground is not entirely solid, and I am going to step onto it anyway because I believe the thing on the other side of it is worth stepping toward. That kind of courage is rarer than wealth and harder to find than a good partner and more worth having than either. And then there is George Torres, whom we have not talked about enough. George, who had been a principal for 30 years and who had learned in those 30 years to read people the way you read a room, quickly, accurately, and without the burden of needing to be right in a way that required defending. George, who looked at Ethan on that first Sunday afternoon and spent 4 seconds deciding and then talked about Elmore Leonard for 40 minutes because he had decided the young man across from him was worth the investment of a genuine conversation. George, who watched from a window at his own daughter's proposal with a coffee cup raised because that was exactly the right thing to do in that moment and he knew it instinctively the way people know things when they have been paying attention their whole lives. George, who was losing certain things to his illness, the steadiness of his hands, the ease of certain mornings, the trips he had planned and cancelled, but who had not lost his ability to see people clearly and to meet them where they actually were. There is something in George's presence in this story that does not get said often enough about people in his situation. He was not a supporting character in the drama of his daughter's life. He was a man living his own full life alongside hers, contributing his wisdom and his humor and his attention and his love at every point where they were needed, even while managing something genuinely difficult. The dignity of that is worth naming. Maggie got her groundedness and her ability to see things clearly from somewhere. She got it from George. And George, in his good chair in the front row at the community hall in December, with his hands steadier than they had been in months and his daughter walking toward the front of the room and the mountains outside the windows going silver in the cold light, George was exactly where he was supposed to be. Exactly who he had always been. That, too, is worth something. That, too, is a kind of love that the story is about. If this story moved you today, if any part of it sat with you in a way that will stay for a little while, we really want to hear from you. Tell us in the comments which moment hit you the hardest. Was it Carol at the kitchen table with the cold cup of tea? Was it Maggie on the floor of her own bakery? Was it Ethan standing outside a door in the dark in a jacket that wasn't warm enough? Was it George Torres raising his coffee cup from the window? Tell us. We read every single comment and we are grateful for every one of them. And if you watched this whole story and you are not yet subscribed to this channel, now is the time. We tell stories like this because we believe that the stories that are quietly true are the ones that matter most and stay the longest. Subscribe so you do not miss what is coming next. Because the next story we are going to tell involves a man who checked into a homeless shelter on a Tuesday night in February and told them his name was just Ray. And what the other people in that shelter discovered about Ray over the following 3 weeks is something that none of them planned for and none of them forgot. That story is coming very soon. We will see you there.